Hello and welcome to this FT Forums discussion and the apologies from us for the late start due to technical issues. We're going to run the discussion for the full hour, but obviously it'll be understandable if some of you need to jump off at 5 o'clock, the original closing time. My name's Andrew Hill. I'm the senior business writer of the Financial Times, and I'm here with Bent Flyvbjerg, who was the first BT Professor of Major Programme Management at Oxford's Saïd Business School, where he still teaches, and is VKR Professor at the IT University of Copenhagen, better known as the global expert on megaprojects, and author of an excellent short new book, How Big Things Get Done. And the answer to that, as we'll discover, plot spoiler, is expensively and usually over a much longer time period than originally predicted. And the book covers everything from the Empire State Building to your kitchen conversion, which is particularly close to home for me as I'm embroiled in a home decoration project that is already over budget and over time and involved me sitting through hours of having floorboards torn up yesterday in an unscheduled diversion from the original plan. So welcome to you all. I want to just start by saying that we hope that we can involve you in this discussion by inviting you to submit questions to Bent and to me as we go along. Don't wait until the end of the discussion forum to pitch in your questions. We will try and take them into account during our conversation. And as I say, we'll finish promptly, I hope, in just under an hour. So when Bent and I first met, which is probably about 10 years ago, around the time of the London Olympics, I remember him asking me who was the architect of the Sydney Opera House. And if you know who the architect of the Sydney Opera House is, what were the other buildings that the architect of the Sydney Opera House designed? And we will come back to this during our discussion. If not before the end, then at the end, we'll reveal why that's important and indeed what the answer is to those two questions. So, Bent, let me just start straight in by asking you, if you will, to describe what you call in the book your iron law of mega projects. What is it and how did you arrive at it?
Yes, first, thank you, Andrew, and FT Forums for having me. And thanks to all of you who are participating and still are here despite the hiccups, and apologies for those. So yeah, the iron law. The iron law is very straightforward and clear. It says over budget, over time, under benefits, over and over again. And that's what happens to the typical mega projects and also smaller projects. They go over budget, they go over time, and they don't deliver the promises. And how did I arrive at this? Well, by studying first hundreds. When I started studying this, there were actually no good data. That's what got me started in the first place, that I had questions about the performance of mega projects, and I couldn't find any answers to when I went to at that time, we still had libraries, and we went to the libraries to find information. And I couldn't find reliable information on this question, like what is the performance of big projects? And this was despite, at that time, already trillions of dollars were spent around the world on projects of this kind. But nobody could answer the question, are they actually delivered, according to the budgets that they set up? How much do they actually cost? Nobody could answer that. How long do they actually take? Nobody could answer that. Do they actually deliver the benefits? Nobody could answer that. So that's what a scholar loves, If there's a wide area on the map, you want to go out there and fill it in. So that's what I did. And like I said, first hundreds of projects, our first database was actually, today I would say only 258 projects. But at that time, that was the biggest database in the world. Today we have more than 16,000 projects in over 100 countries, over on all continents except Antarctica, and And the iron law is still the same, and it's been the same from the beginning. But anyway, that's the answer to your question, Andrew. How did I arrive at it? Well, with my team, we studied thousands of projects, and this is what the data show.
Right. And just give us an idea, and perhaps I should have asked this right at the beginning, what constitutes a mega project as far as your studies are concerned?
So there's no firm agreement of what the definition is of a mega project. So you will find different definitions in the literature. I usually say, just as a fast and frugal rule of thumb, that it's any project that costs over $1 billion and affects very large numbers of people, and typically takes a long time to deliver.
Right. And on those three criteria, when you started studying this, and indeed over time as you've been studying it, what's the sort of percentage that hits the mark on each of those, and indeed on all three?
Yeah. So if you look at it like this, how many projects are on budget or better? That's 48.5%. If you look at how many are on budget and on time or better, then all of a sudden the percentage drops to 8.5%. So more than 90% are not on budget or on time. And if you then add the third dimension, the benefits, the revenues, and ask how many projects are on budget and on time and deliver the promised benefits, that's 0.5%, 0.5%. It's stunning. And it shocked us when we first saw this, how bad the performance is. And that's why we say in the book, it's bad, but it's worse than you think it is. That's like the subtitle on the chapter where we are documenting the iron law. It's really bad.
Right. And I mean, are we getting any better? Obviously, when you started your work, it wasn't documented. You have done a lot of work. You've provided a lot of advice to companies, governments, organizations, and individuals running mega projects. Is there any sign of improvement?
So when I started doing this work, there was actually no interest in this. Actually, I think there was an interest in keeping this hidden, because it's a good business model, to go out and build really expensive projects and not having to care about the budget. I would love to be in a business where you could do that. So I actually felt there was some resistance to getting, the facts on the table regarding budget overruns and so on. And I would say the biggest change that has happened since then is that now there's a lot of interest in these issues, and that's global, that's worldwide. So the issues are taken seriously. There are still certain parties that are trying to sweep things under the rug, but it's much less common, and people are much less successful at hiding things than they used to be. Things are getting better in pockets. So you'll have whole organizations and whole governments who actually have decided to give this priority and to train people to get the data, get the tools and so on that you need in order to do it right. So things are improving in that sense, but it's not like things have changed overnight and now, the majority of projects are delivered on budgets and on schedule and to benefits. That hasn't happened. So it's still a bad situation, but with clear signs of improvement. And you can look at those pockets and you can see that these organizations are actually improving, who are using the right thinking and the right tools.
Right. I mean, you do enumerate in the book the sheer waste involved in these types of overruns. I think you equate it to the GDPs of various nations, the amount that could be saved if only most projects could be brought in on time and on budget. I mean, is that a driving force for you in trying to help people solve this problem?
Yes, it is. I mean, this is just hugely wasteful. That's one driving force, is to reduce the waste. But another driving force is that there's actually a lot of joy and benefits and aesthetic beauty in many of these projects, and I think that the world can be a better place, and is actually a better place for some of the really good and successful projects, and who wouldn't want more of that, so that's another driving force. It's not only about reducing waste, which I think is very honorable, But it's not enough, That's like just reducing a problem. In addition to just reducing a problem, I would also like to see real benefits, come out of it. And we see that. So it's a real joy to work with people who know how to do these things and pool our resources and see what we can do in the real world.
Right. Well, let's get into the meat of this. And one of the great things about this topic, which I've always found fascinating, is that of course, because they're mega projects, they're hugely visible in lots of cases, and well known landmarks and infrastructure that we're familiar with, perhaps even if we haven't visited the places. I mean, I leave it up to you, Bent, really, whether you want to start with successes or perhaps always more interesting to journalists, failures that illustrate some of the points that you think could be improved here. Where would you like to begin?
Well, if I start with some of the successes, like who doesn't like the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco? It's a huge success, both aesthetically but also technically and economically, obviously. Who doesn't like the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao? Frank Gehry's most famous building. And you can mention, luckily, you can mention many projects like that are actually both a pleasure to the eye, but also economically, and technically. But like you indicated, like we just talked about with the iron law, there are many, many more projects where it's the opposite, where it's not only bad, it's disastrous. So very often financial disasters, but also technical disasters, the things that just don't work, and
Right.
It takes a long time to make them work. And usually when they are made to work, it's not at the level that they were supposed to work and so on. So one of the disasters right here at our doorstep, I'm in Oxford right now, so the Channel Tunnel between the UK and France is a financial disaster, was a financial disaster right from the outset and is still a financial disaster. It went insolvent fairly quickly after it opened because of a huge overrun and a huge revenue shortfall. And then again, it never became a solid business. So the pandemic, with its fall in passengers, again drove the project to insolvency, and it had to be bailed out. Actually, it had to be helped during the pandemic, like so many other businesses. I mean, this is not because it was a mega project, but because it was a mega project that was already financially fragile. So it can't take the beatings up of things like a pandemic and so on. So that's an example right here.
Right. Let me talk a little bit about one of the successes, and perhaps draw you into discussing what are the kind of solutions here. I mean, you mentioned Frank Gehry. I know you've worked with him a lot and still work with him even in his 90s now. And you make a lot in the book about the Guggenheim Museum, which most people, even if they haven't visited, will be familiar with that glistening steel shell, almost unlike anything else that you've seen. What does Frank Gehry get right? Because I know you're a fan of the way in which he approaches these big projects.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm actually a fan of both Gehry and Jörn. Oops, I can't say that. But the architect of the Sydney Opera House. And I would say to the audience here, if you haven't already seen the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao and the Sydney Opera House, you got to go. This is like those are probably the two most spectacular buildings of the last century. And you don't have to believe me, this is a general consensus among people who evaluate these things. And you got to see that they're amazing. So the question about Frank Gehry, what is it that I like about? Well, first of all, I was a student in Los Angeles at UCLA, and at that time, Frank Gehry was a local architect. He was known, but only locally. He hadn't gotten to world fame yet. He hadn't built the Guggenheim Bilbao yet. He hadn't built the Walt Disney Concert Hall yet. But he was building some interesting stuff. So I got really interested in this guy who was actually building in my neighborhood. I lived on Venice Beach. He lived in Santa Monica, right next door. And he still has his studio close to there. I've been there several times visiting him. And he's been here in Oxford several times visiting us here. And what I picked up was that he actually builds on, he cares. That's the first thing I picked up, that he's an architect who talks about budget and schedule. Most architects like to disregard that, say, we don't care about this. This is too mundane. Our job is to make the beautiful building. And I've heard many architects say this is actually the normal attitude, is that nobody cares about the cost of a building a few years after it has been completed. Everybody cares about how it looks then. And of course, there's an element of truth to that, but it's very, I mean, it's a very dubious attitude to say, I don't have to care about the budget. I don't have to care about the schedule. And Gary was building for his friends, you know, and he didn't want to put his friends through things like that. So he actually, from early on, he was serious about staying on budget and staying on schedule, simply out of respect for the people that he was building for.
Right.
And later he took that with him when he started doing the really big projects, and he's been able to, fulfill those criteria of building on budget and building on time, especially because the way he has developed his business, he's using certain digital tools, you know, where he can simulate the buildings on computer before he builds them. So he actually knows the ins and outs, the details of the building before he goes out and builds them. And we find that in the book, we point that out as a general characteristic of the people who are successful with their projects, is because they prepare the projects the way Gary does, which is in a lot of detail, going through lots of iterations of the same project, trying, learning, improving, trying again, learning again, improving again. And Gary literally goes through thousands of versions of a building before they even start digging, you know, the hole
Right.
that it's going to be built in.
But he's able to do that using the design technology that's now freely available. It surprised me reading that. Of course, it seems obvious when you read it that you could use computerized techniques to do the trial and error that you can't do when you're actually working on the ground, as it were. But it surprised me that that wasn't just common practice now, and that it hadn't eliminated some of the cost and time overruns that you talk about.
This is the thing we find over and over. Like you say, why is this not common practice? Because it's common sense, right? But let me tell you, one thing we find with big project is that common sense is not very common.
Right.
It's actually a very, very important finding. You know, common sense is not very common. There ought to be a lot more common sense in big projects, and there isn't. So you're right, these tools, specifically CATIA, that Gary is using, are available, but it actually takes real skill to use them. So a lot of people try and they just don't succeed. I've been on several projects, you know, where the digital model of the project that they were supposed to do all these iterations on is sitting in a corner. They gave up on it and they just went back to the usual way. And now they're using it as some kind of entertainment for visitors. They will show some out-of-date models on the IT. And I bet you a lot of people who are in the audience here, if they work in construction, they will nod their heads to this. Yeah, we've seen that too, because it's so common. So that's
Right.
common, not common sense.
Yes. Two things that struck me about your description of Gary's way of working. One, and this is notable in the book as well. When I looked at the chapters, I thought there's an awful lot in this book about planning and forecasting. I mean, and actually comparatively little about the building and the. It's a lot of emphasis that you place on planning, which I know he does as well, as you're describing. But also his initial question when he's brought onto a project about why the project is being done, which you point out is critical really to getting it right in over the longer run, right?
Yeah. So this thing about asking why, that's the key thing. You know, you need to know why you're doing something before you start doing it. And that actually is not our spontaneous way of doing things. So behavioral economists and behavioral scientists in general have found this thing that we have something called availability bias, that we actually like to go with the first thing that we see. Danny Kahneman, the preeminent behavioral economist, psychologist and behavioral economist, talks about something he calls WYSIATI. It's an abbreviation for what you see is all there is. And we are like that, you know, as humans. We seem to be hardwired to think that what we see is all there is, and also to jump to conclusions, including solutions, really quickly without stepping back and asking, why are we doing this? Why do things look the way they do? And Gary does that. He himself says that this is because he was brought up on the Talmud, and he's Jewish, and he says that this is the Jewish religion. We always ask why. This is part of the way. This is part of our culture. So when we interviewed him, he explained it like that. He said that this is the way I was brought up, and this is the way I was doing it. Also, it helped that he had a stage in his life where he went through psychotherapy, and he said that also helped him start asking fundamental questions and really listening to other people. So asking why and listening is not enough to ask why if you're not listening, obviously. So this is the first thing Gary does with clients, is sit down and ask, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to do this project? And really get to the core of it. Because like he says, I can't give you what you want if I don't know exactly why you want it.
Right.
So that's a key thing.
How did that apply in the case of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao? What was the answer to the why question there?
So the Guggenheim in Bilbao was financed by the local government, by the Basque government. Bilbao is the biggest town in the Basque region in northern Spain. And the government there thought they had the answer. They said, we have this beautiful old wine storage building in the center of town. We want to turn it into a Guggenheim museum, and in that way get people to come here and get more tourists, get more revenues. We need to get back on the map. We used to be an industrial town, a harbor town, so steel industry and shipping. That's not working anymore. The steel industry has gone down, shipping has gone down. So we need something else, and this is what we want. We want to be a tourist attraction like that. Spain has lots of tourists, but they go to the southern part of Spain and to Madrid. We want some here in northern Spain. So they thought they knew why. Gary looked at the building and he said, it's a beautiful building, I agree with you, but it won't do it. They wanted Gary to renovate the old building and make it into a museum. He said, if you want to do what you want to do, you need to build a new building. They had also told him what they wanted was they wanted Gary to do for Bilbao what the Sydney Opera House had done for Sydney. So they wanted this, what's now called the Bilbao effect, funny enough, but they wanted the Sydney effect, right? And they told Gary this, and he said, I can't give you this effect by renovating an old building. We need to build something spectacular and new. They actually went to a restaurant at the top of the hills above Bilbao where they could look down on the city, and he spotted a plot along the river in a really nice place, actually right next to a bridge, exactly like in Sydney. So he had the bridge like in Sydney, where it's the harbor bridge, and here it's a different bridge in Bilbao, and a big empty industrial plot, along the river. He said, that's the plot. If we can get that, I can give you a building there and try to do for Bilbao what the Sydney Opera House did for Sydney. And actually, very quickly, the government turned around and said, you're right. So that's how they came up with this idea, and they did it. And of course, they couldn't know whether they would succeed, but we now know that they succeeded immensely. Like they've had 3 times as many visitors and revenues and everything, both for the museum itself, for the city, and for the whole region than they hoped in their wildest dreams that they would get.
Right. I don't think we can put off the answer to the question about the Sydney Opera House any longer, because obviously it is the counterexample, if you like, of a civic project that went wildly over time and over budget. Perhaps set it in context against the success of the Guggenheim. What went wrong with the Sydney Opera House, and why don't many people know who built it?
So I would say that both projects are hugely successful aesthetically, right? And I'm not alone in saying that. One was hugely successful in the way it was delivered. That's the Guggenheim Bilbao, Gary's building. And the Sydney Opera House is used as the poster example of how not to deliver a project. And it had a 1,400% cost overrun. It had a 10-year delay, insanely late, insanely over budgets, because everything was done wrong, on that project. The reason things went wrong in Sydney were mainly that they started building before they knew what they were doing. That's not a good idea. Also, the architect was very young, in his 30s when he won. That's very young for an architect. 30s is very young for an architect. Gary was in his 60s when he won the competition for the Bilbao Guggenheim. So he had, as much more experience than most architects have when they retire, he had when he was designing the Guggenheim Bilbao. So he had already gone through hard times, tried difficult clients and difficult projects, and he knew how to do projects by then, which was a huge benefit for the client in Bilbao. Whereas in Sydney, Utzon, the architect of the Sydney Opera House, didn't have the same.
I think we better name him now.
So the architect
fellow Dane.
is Jørgen Utzon, a fellow Dane. But what about the second question? Now, can you name another building? And this is especially for those of you who are not Danish. Can you mention another building designed and built by Jørgen Utzon? So anyways, he was young and inexperienced. Also, the client, the New South Wales government, was a terrible client. They just didn't know what they were doing, and they managed the whole thing dismally. And of course, the architect always get blamed. So Utzon got blamed, and he actually left in the middle of construction, which is unheard of for an architect. So midway through construction, he got on a plane with his family secretly, and left Australia, where he had moved with his family. He planned to live there all through the delivery of the Sydney Opera House, but had to discontinue his plans when he had so many problems with the client, and they stopped paying his salary and so on. So he simply couldn't stay. So everything went wrong in every way you want to look at it. They even had to dynamite out pieces of the Opera House because they didn't have final drawings when they started building it. So they built things that didn't fit in the end, and they had to dynamite it out. And today you actually have an opera house that is unsuited for opera. So specialists in opera, they agree you should, if you have an opera you want to perform, don't perform it in the Sydney Opera House. It is not suited for opera.
So it's failed on all three counts that you describe in the Iron Law. And just tell us why you think it's important that nobody can name anything else that Jørgen Utzon built.
Well, for me, the painful thing is that Utzon's career was destroyed. So I go to Sydney, and I've done it several times, gone there and just spent a lot of time hanging around the Opera House and really soaking in all that is giving me and everybody else who goes there. It's an amazing feat, to be able to build something like that. And then the person who is able to do that, and this is Utzon's, it's his feat. He actually did this, and it would never have happened without him. Then you kill his career and don't allow him to do another building. To me, that's evil. You shouldn't treat people like that, and that's the loss. So for me, it's not even the 1,400% cost overrun. I would actually agree there with the architects who say, who cares about the budget once you have the building? Like, we could get over that, and the building has made much more money for Sydney and Australia than that cost overrun. But what I can't disregard and what I can't forgive, basically, is that the career of an eminent architect, that Jørgen Utzon, was destroyed by the government of New South Wales mismanaging their project the way they did.
Right. So one question that's already come in, which we're sort of beginning to touch on, are the key factors that all successful projects have in common, or that you'd need to bear in mind for the success of a project. And a couple, let me summarize from what we've discussed so far, that were present in the Guggenheim Bilbao and not in Sydney. One is the planning point. Obviously, Gary, using the computerized techniques, among other things, just spending a lot of time on working out why the project was required, what was required of the project. Whereas I think Utzon, his original sketches were described, am I right, as a beautiful doodle?
A magnificent doodle, nothing more than a magnificent doodle. Yeah.
So, and as you yourself said, he ended up having to blow things up and restart bits of it. And I think I'm right in saying that even the final shape, although it is iconic now, doesn't look like the original Magnificent Doodle, because he simply couldn't build the Magnificent Doodle.
They couldn't figure out how to build it. So the Magnificent Doodle didn't say that's the doodle that won the competition, but it didn't say anything about which material are we going to build this in, what are the techniques and technology that we can use to actually build this thing, and they couldn't figure it out, and therefore Arab engineers, a London company, which was already big and famous worldwide at the time, they were hired as engineers to figure out how to do it, and they worked with Utzon very closely. So Arab was another Dane. So Utzon and Arab teamed up, and they worked really hard for years. And I think that the general agreement is that it would never have happened without Arab. You couldn't have built the Sydney Opera House without Arab. And he and his team figured out how can you actually build those shells or something that looked like them, but they had to build them at a steeper angle. Otherwise, they would collapse, they figured at the time.
Yes. So
it's interesting because I talked to Gary about this, and he told me, we actually took the original doodles and ran them through our simulation, the CATIA program, and we figured out that it could have been built, but they didn't have that digital tools at the time they simply didn't have the computing power and the tools to be able to do that. So it wasn't possible at the time of Utzon, but it would be possible today. Gary has proved by running it through CATIA and proving that they could actually build it today.
Right, that's fascinating.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Not a lot of people know this.
The other point that you raise, by comparison between the experience of Gary and the relative inexperience of Utzon, is the one that is mentioned in your book about the importance of getting people who know what they're doing on the job. Hiring the right team, I think, is one of the points that you make there. I mean, clearly, if you've got a choice, you probably, however exciting the Magnificent Doodle is, you probably want somebody who has built stuff before that can stand as a marker that they can achieve the project. Is that the way of looking at this?
Yeah, we have a whole chapter about experience, and experience is hugely disregarded. It's really strange, because again, this is common sense. I mean, it's really common sense that if you are going to do something, you want to hire somebody who has tried to do it before, right? Including your home renovation. You want somebody who has tried to do it before. That's common sense. But let me tell you that common sense is not typically abided by on mega projects. It is so common to hire somebody who actually has never tried to build a mega project before. I was an expert witness just recently on a huge dam in Canada that has gone wrong. And it turned out that they couldn't find a team when they were going to build this huge hydroelectric dam that had tried to build a hydroelectric dam before. So they said, what do we do? Well, we have a lot of people who are building big projects in oil and gas. And, if you know how to build a big project in oil and gas, why wouldn't you know how to build a dam? And they hired a team from oil and gas to build the dam with disastrous consequences. So that's a typical example of what's going on. It's unbelievable, but you have people who have never tried to build a certain type of project before. They are responsible for building it.
Yes, I mean, I guess they could have applied a reverse technique of saying, would we ever hire a dam builder to drill an oil well? But
Exactly.
That might have been an approach to apply. But one thing that runs throughout the book is this danger of optimism, the kind of underlying failing of people becoming over optimistic about all elements of projects, from design to timing to budget. Talk us through a little bit more, particularly how one avoids that, because we all want to go into anything from a kitchen remodeling to the Eiffel Tower. We all want to go in hoping and expecting that it's going to succeed.
Yeah. So we're talking a lot about big projects now, but this actually applies to projects of any size, including a small kitchen renovation, as we have a whole chapter about a kitchen renovation that goes wrong.
Yes, a disastrous one, yes.
In the book. And we talk a lot about cognitive biases or biases in general in the book, and we find two types of biases: psychological biases and what we call power biases. And they are the reasons for things going so wrong. So you talk about optimism. That's Danny Kahneman says that's probably the most important. The preeminent cognitive bias is optimism bias. like we are hardwired to be optimists. And that's a good thing, of course, in many situations, but in some situations it's really bad. So you don't want to hear a pilot who is optimistic about the fuel situation on their plane, right? I'm optimistic about the fuel situation, doesn't work. The same if you're optimistic about your budget on a project, it also doesn't work, or the schedule. You need to be realistic. And that gets us to, what do you do about this? You ask for solutions, and you need to be realistic. You need to introduce realism, and that's what characterized the successful people. I characterize them as realistic optimists. So they are actually very realistic about the situation they work in, but they have this optimistic can-do attitude that we actually can do, a completely innovative architectural structure on budget and on time, like the Guggenheim. You need that kind of person. You also need to debias decisions. So we have developed methods for this, and this is something that behavioral economists excel at, finding out how do we debias a decision. And we have developed a method called reference class forecasting on the basis of Kahneman and Tversky's work, which is now widely used around the world, including in the UK. It's actually mandatory in the UK. The UK government has decided that big transport infrastructure projects must use reference class forecasting, and they have a whole setup with a green book and everything about how to do it. So that's an example of how do you solve these problems. If bias is the problem, you debias. It's that simple. And there are different methods for debiasing.
Yes.
And political bias, same thing. You can debias for political bias too.
Yes, I'd like you to explain a little bit more about reference class forecasting and what that involves. But just first of all, while you were talking about government, there's a question came in about whether who is mainly at fault, the government or the business, when they partner on a mega project that suffers failure.
So, I mean, government and business can partner in so many ways. So it depends on the specific setup,
Right.
I wouldn't want to point finger at one or the other. There's a general perception that government is particularly bad and business is better. And I can tell you that doesn't hold up. Both are bad. Right. Both business and government are bad. And that's both for projects where it's 100% business or 100% government, or where they're collaborating, for instance, in public-private partnerships or PFIs. So there is no easy fix to this. PPP was, so public-private partnerships were originally launched as an easy fix, like if we just do it like this, we can transfer the risk to the builders or the vendors, if it's IT and so on. And it totally doesn't hold up, in reality, and which is one of the reasons that PPP is not so in vogue anymore, that it's actually not done very much anymore. So I would say there's no easy fix. It's a problem both in the public and the private sector, whether they're collaborating or not. We do study this in detail now and seeing, are there differences? So I can say right now I'm doing an in-depth study of the difference with IT delivery in the public and the private sector. And the conclusion is exactly like I say, that both are bad, but actually the private sector is a bit better than the public sector. So there is a difference, but it's not a difference that I would say, okay, so the solution is the way they do it in the private sector. Let me tell you, if you talk to people who run banks, and banks, of course, are totally digital these days, they have huge problems, and they acknowledge this. They're not, trying to fool anyone, saying that it's easy to run the IT projects that you need to run a bank. They know it's very difficult.
Right. Just talk a little about reference class forecasting. One of the ways in which you think that risk can be mitigated in a big project, and also particularly in that context about when there doesn't appear to be any obvious reference that you can rely on. If you're building something that is bigger and more different than anything else that's ever been built, how do you go about finding some way of comparing that with the past?
So the first thing, like reference class forecasting, what is it? Let me take a story from the book, that Robert Caro is a famous American author. He actually has a film out right now about how he works. I was watching some of it last night. And he wrote a very famous book. The first book that got him famous was called The Power Broker, about Robert Moses, who was like he was the construction czar in New York City, and he's probably the American and maybe the person in the world who has built the most mega projects ever. There might be people in China now that have done more, but we don't hear about that. It's possible. I won't rule that out, but that would be the only possibility of somebody doing more. So he basically completely reconfigured New York with a long string of mega projects over 40, 50 years. And Robert Caro, the author, decided to write a book about him at one stage. And at that stage, Caro was a journalist with a newspaper in New York, and he had to, he quit his job to write this book, and he had to figure out, do I have enough money, on the advance that I get for the book to write the book? And he said, okay, so a book is, he actually went modular, like we argue in the book that you need to do, like a book consists of chapters. Like, how long would it take me to write a chapter? And then he looked at his experience as a journalist, and he says a chapter is it's like, a couple of long feature articles in the newspaper. And usually I get 2-3 weeks from the editor to write something like that. So I figure a chapter is going to take, around 3 weeks. And on that basis, he estimated that it would take 9 months to write the book. So it's just like 12 chapters of 3 weeks, it's 9 months. And then he said, like very sensible thinking, he said, let me add 3 months and say 1 year. So I have enough money for 1 year to write this book. And he quit his job and started writing. But he wasn't finished after 1 year. Then he and his wife sold their house because they needed money they actually had to totally change their family life and move into a flat that Cara, I saw him say it last night on the film. He said, I hated that flat. So he had to live under miserable circumstances because he didn't meet the time schedule for how long it took. And it actually ended up taking him 7 years to write the book. And he got to hate the question when people asked him, how are you doing on your book? How's it going? And people would ask, how long have you been working on it? He hated that until 5 years in. So 2 years before he finished the book, he applied for a desk at the New York Public Library. So they have a section, a special room, where people who are working on big books that are using the source material in the library, they can get a desk there and work there so that they're close to their material. And he got that. Then he met some other authors, and they would ask him this question that he hated. And he said, well, so far I've taken 5 years. And then this author he was talking to would say, well, that's not so bad. I've taken 7 years so far on my Roosevelt book, or whatever it was that author was writing on. So all of a sudden, Carroll realized that he's got his estimate totally wrong. And here's what he could have done. It's so easy, again, commonsensical. Instead of looking at the wrong anchor, so we call this anchoring, and this is another fallacy and cognitive bias that we have. We anchor in the wrong thing. So he anchored in his experience as a journalist for writing a book, assuming that they would be comparable.
He chose the wrong reference class, in fact.
He chose the wrong reference class. And what he could have done if he had chosen the right reference class, and it's a no-brainer if you think about it, he could have identified 10, 20 books that he thought were like the book that he was trying to write. He could have sent a note to each of the authors and asked them, how long did it take you to write this book? I need to know because I'll run out of money if I don't know. Right. And probably quite a few of them would have answered him. And he would simply add those numbers, divide by the number of people who answered, and he would have a realistic anchor. He would have the right anchor, which would be the anchor for the type of book he's trying to write. It wouldn't even take long. He wouldn't have to spend a lot of money on data collection in this case, which you do sometimes. You have to spend a lot of money on data collection. But that's how simple reference class forecasting is. Right. You just need to have a class of projects similar to the one that you're doing.
Yes, there's something very appropriate about the book about the architect or manager of many mega projects, Robert Moses, being himself the subject of a mega project type book. So, and I mean, in the case where there's something where there isn't no obvious reference, there are ways around that as well, right? If you're producing something that appears to be a one-off or a new type of project by size or scale or design, can you still construct a proxy for the reference class there?
Yeah. So first of all, project leaders, project owners, project managers tend to think of their projects as unique, and they almost never are. So I've asked this question of more than 1,000 really high-level project managers. Do you think your project is unique? And the vast majority think their projects are unique. We call it uniqueness bias. It's another cognitive bias. And it actually turns out that the project managers who think their projects are unique, they underperform project managers who think their products are not unique. So it's a negative thing. It's easy to understand why, because if you think your product is unique, you don't have anything to learn from other projects, right? So you don't look for it if you think your product is unique. So the first thing is to, and this is the majority of cases, is just to kill that illusion and show your project is not unique. And here's the reference class that is relevant for you. And we have done this over and over. Hundreds of times, we have done this and come up with reference classes that could be used. But I actually had an instance where I myself fell for uniqueness bias, and I thought that the project was unique. This was the Swedish government contacted me and said, we are decommissioning our nuclear power plants, so we are making a plan for decommissioning our nuclear power plants. And we want the nuclear industry to pay for the decommissioning. So we need to know how much it's going to cost to decommission nuclear power plants. Otherwise, we can't estimate, the fee that we are going to start charging the nuclear industry. Can you help us? And I said, no, I can't. Because at that time, no nuclear power plants have been decommissioned except, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl.
Right.
Under very special circumstances. That's not a normal decommissioning. That's like a nuclear accident, and then you have decommissioning. And that's not what they were talking about in Sweden. So I actually said there is no reference class, so we can't do a reference class forecast of this. But then the guy, a very experienced civil servant in Sweden, Sven Bergendahl, he said, Bent, I read your book called Megaprojects and Risk, and I have a consultant report that where I asked this question, how much it's going to cost us and what is the cost risk of decommissioning nuclear power, that actually estimate the cost and the risk as lower than the risk you estimate for transport infrastructure. Surely that is wrong. I mean, we have done transport infrastructure for hundreds of years, and it's a very well-described process. We know how to do it, and still, and nuclear decommissioning we've never tried before, so surely the risk must be larger in nuclear decommissioning. Wouldn't you agree? And I said, yeah, I would agree. So here's what I suggest. He says that we use the numbers from your book for transport infrastructure as a floor. So we say this is the lower level of risk. Then we start charging the nuclear industry on that basis. And then as we learn more about nuclear decommissioning, we will raise the floor, and eventually, this is something that is going to happen over decades. So we have time, to adjust the fee and eventually get enough money in the box to pay for the nuclear decommission. That actually became national Swedish policy. So we developed a system for that, and they used it. And of course, before that, they fired the consultants who had come up with these totally fictitious numbers for what it would cost. And this is common in consulting in this area, is that you will find reports that look really serious, but they're completely non-serious when you start picking the numbers apart.
Yes. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to just tackle some of the questions that we haven't asked, and perhaps lead us to add to some of the lessons that you lay out in the book. So we've sort of partly answered this, because you've mentioned that smaller projects, this isn't unique to mega projects, some of these misunderstandings, some of these misleading ways of handling things. So the question, can your advice be applied to smaller projects within businesses? Presumably the answer there is yes, is it? And not just in businesses, as you mentioned. There's a great example in your book of a Brooklyn kitchen conversion that goes horribly wrong and never seems to end and costs much more than expected. These are all mindset and techniques that can be applied to smaller projects.
Yeah. Any size of project, you can apply this kind of thinking and the tools that we developed and that we cover in the book. And we make a big point of this, that this is both for small projects and big projects. It's like writing a book. We just talked about that, Caro, right? Robert Caro writing a book. We even have planning a wedding is an example in the book, or having a festival, doing a conference and so on. going on holiday, and all the way up to space exploration. So it's the same principles, and it's easy to understand why, because like I said, this is about psychology and power. That means that it's about human behavior. And it's humans doing this, no matter whether it's a big project or it's a small project. We have the same psychology, and we have the same types of behavior regarding jockeying for position or competing for resources or whatever, which is where the power bias comes in. Power bias gets more and more pronounced the bigger the project is, but cognitive bias, psychological biases are the same whether the project is big or small. So yeah, this applies to all sizes of projects.
One thing, while we're talking about size, that you do suggest as a technique is this modularity approach. I think you describe it in terms of Lego blocks, breaking down larger projects into smaller modules. Perhaps you could talk to us a bit about a project that worked in that way.
This is actually very interesting, and this is something that we document for the first time in this book, and it's a stunning outcome. Our research result is that the more modular a project is, the less it goes over budget, the less it goes over schedule, and the easier it is to deliver benefits. And it's got a lot to do with speed. So the more modular a project is, the faster you can deliver it. So after you've gone through all this careful planning, which we call think slow, we also advise act fast. So think slow, act fast. That's the rhythm of a good project. Think slow, act fast. If you have modules, you can act fast. And an example that you asked for would be server farms is a clear example. Solar farms is a clear example. Wind farms are clear examples. A solar cell, the name says it, is modular. The cell is the basic module. Then you put a number of solar cells on a panel. Then you have a bunch of solar cells that will produce more electricity. Then you make an array, that's a lot of panels, and you make many arrays, you have a farm. That's how you build a solar farm, and it's all built on the basis of the same module, the solar cell, and it's really easy. It's uncomplicated, so you don't get all these things about bespoke projects that because it's modular, right?
Yes.
Server farms, the same thing. You have one server, you stack them, and you get a farm.
Yes, you specifically warn readers against the being attracted by anything that's bespoke or custom made, because it's going to go wrong. But also, you mentioned that the Empire State Building was in some respects a modular project, because as they built it upwards, floor by floor, they were applying the same techniques to each floor. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's a very early modular project. They actually tried to make each floor identical. Obviously they had to be narrow. They had to narrow the building as they were going up, so there were slight differences. But they actually made sure that as much as possible was identical on each floor, because then the builders could build it faster. And they actually got to a pace where they were building more than a floor a day. That's pretty amazing. And it was built on time. It was built on way below budget. It was built really fast because they modularized the whole thing, and they also had this think slow phase first. They really thought it out in every detail before they started building. They called it a conveyor belt. So that they were this was in the 1930s and late 20s, when conveyor belts were being implemented in manufacturing, car manufacturing especially. And they said, hey, we were inspired by that, except with us, is the conveyor belt that does the moving. So they were moving the conveyor belt up the building instead of moving, the floors along the conveyor belt. They were just moving the conveyor belt, but the logic was the same. So it was manufacturing. They thought they were manufacturing this building. They weren't building it. And that's actually an incredibly important thought in construction. Even today, you need to get out of construction and into manufacturing if the construction industry is going to survive.
Yes. We've got a couple of minutes left. I just want to take one last question, which was actually the first question posed, which is about risk and mega project management. And you touch on this in the book. How do you best prepare for the black swan event, for the risk that something big, a hurricane, a pandemic, a supply chain holdup is going to throw your mega project off?
So we call that black swan management, and we have a whole section about that in the book, how important that is. And one of the findings that we a finding that we document for the first time is that the majority of mega projects are fat tails. So you actually have fat tails in performance, including cost overruns and schedule overruns. And how do you protect yourself against that? Because that's what you need to do if you want to protect yourself against disaster. It's different from project to project, but let me give you an example. Again, a story from the book. High Speed 2, so the most expensive project in all of Europe right now, the high-speed rail line from London to Birmingham and further north here in the UK. We worked with them, to do black swan management, and they found that. So first, we looked at all high-speed rail projects, and we looked at the fat tail, and we identified all the projects that had been exposed to black swans and why. And we found a list of reasons. And one of the reasons, the top reason that stood out, was archaeology. That when you start digging through a country like the UK, which is has a lot of history, you're going to hit historical archaeological sites immediately.
Sure.
And it's actually difficult to get archaeologists on sites, and that slows the project down, just having to deal with all these archaeological sites. So what did we come up with? Well, we decided to put every archaeologist in the UK on a retainer, that they would work for HS2 if necessary. Just to shorten all those delays, and it has had a massive effect, and it also has turned HS2 into one of the biggest, sources of archaeological knowledge, in the country. So one thing that they think is positive about this. So that's an example. You need to look at the specifics and you look at that project type, and then you say, what is it that typically derails this project type? And for high-speed rail, archaeology is one of the top reasons. And then you deal with it in a practical way, where you make sure that the archaeologists are on standby, so you don't slow down the project by having to wait and getting a bottleneck for archaeological surveys.
Right, that's a brilliant example, and actually also brilliantly, perhaps inadvertently, answers one of the other questions that we had, which was specifically about the HS2 project, which is going to be one of those great mega project case studies if it's ever finished. I think we're out of time, Bent. Thank you very much for your insights. Thank you for talking us through the rights and wrongs of mega projects. How Big Things Get Done is the book that we've been referring to. Well worth reading for yet more examples, colourful examples of what can go wrong and how to avoid it happening. Thank you very much for joining us. Apologies again for the delay in starting. I hope you've enjoyed our hour together. I certainly have. And thank you, Bent Flyvbjerg, for your insights over the last hour.